One, it made it so that I couldn't think that race didn't matter
Right.
because when I walked around the streets of the Austin neighborhood and I walked regularly, I took public transportation, I was always aware of the fact that I was white. And if I saw other white people in the neighborhood who I didn't know, I thought, "Why are you here?"
Right. Yeah.
And that's good. That's
Yeah.
good to
Yeah.
have that experience.
Welcome to
Um,
A Theology of Hustle. Make sure you're subscribed on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast, and follow me at Theology of Hustle on Instagram. Now, let's get to work. All right. Well, Dr. Karen Johnson, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
my pleasure. It's great to be here, Curry. Thank you.
Yeah, I love it. I love already the connections. We have all these like little connections together. It's super fun to see how small of a world it is out there, you know.
Yeah, yeah. We're just a few degrees separated from everyone, and especially, I think we joke about the small world of Wheaton, um,
Yes.
here in Wheaton, and you've got ties there too.
Very much so. Yes, very much so. That's great. Okay, let's just kick off and kind of have you give like a quick rundown, a quick bio, who you are, what you do, that sort of thing.
Yeah, thank you. So first, I'm married to Eric Johnson, who I joke, and I think is actually true. He's the real teacher in the family. He's a sixth grade Bible and social studies teacher.
Oh,
I
nice.
have four kids, ages 3 to 11, so our lives are full. And I'm also a historian and a professor of history at Wheaton College.
Yeah, that's awesome. Three to 11, and school's about to start. You must be going out of your mind right now. It's crazy
Um,
time.
so we are transitioning from and actually from travel to home. I've been thinking a lot about what does it mean to return to a place and how to do that well.
That's good. That's good. That's a tricky one, especially with littles. They don't transition quite as easy as we do sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, let's go ahead and jump off, and I just love to hear your story. I love how God kind of shapes stories. So how did you decide that history was something you wanted to delve into more?
Such a good question, and I love your attention to story as a historian. I think that's what drew me to story in
Mm,
the first place. I
right.
grew up with grandparents, and especially my grandparents would just talk about their lives, and that was really interesting to me. And when I was in undergrad, um, I am a second generation college student. Both of my parents have very practical degrees, and they wanted me to study something practical so I get a job. And when I couldn't decide what I wanted and said, I want to study the liberal arts, um, they encouraged me to go to the best school I could get into. And I went to Carleton College in Minnesota, which is a
Okay.
small liberal arts school. And there I was treating myself to history classes. I'd be taking these classes and think, oh, I want to treat myself to a history class. And when I was studying, I tend to, I think, be slow to sort of realize discernment and what the next steps are. And I was studying abroad at Cambridge and studying economics in England. And it was actually there that I decided I wanted to study history. Because if you think about the way I put it to myself, I was like, if I think about bell curves, I'm really interested in the outliers, not sort of the like what's within a few standard deviations. And so that's how I first decided to study history as undergrad. Um, I graduated not knowing what to do with my life, unlike at Wheaton, where we have a lot of thinking about vocation and calling. Probably students get tired of us talking about that all the time. We didn't have very much of that.
Okay.
This was the early 2000s, and there just wasn't as much of a conversation. Um, and I worked at a wonderful company, but I had like no meaning.
Mm,
And I think now, if I'd had sort of a broader sense of vocation, maybe it would have worked out,
yeah.
and I would have stayed in the corporate world, which is, I know, one of your callings.
Yes, indeed. Yes,
But
indeed.
at the time, the company paid for grad school, or they paid for school
Okay.
classes at any accredited institution. And so one of the things I did was I started taking classes at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, which was close to where I lived, and I was working on a master's degree in Christian thought, and I thought I'll either um, go on and get a PhD or I'll be a missionary
Mm,
somewhere in Africa. and I wasn't at a stage yet where I thought about like specifics of different places. Um, and it was there that I met my husband, who was doing an MDiv. And there's kind of a long story about history and him that I could go into if you want. But I ended up eventually applying to UIC, University of Illinois at Chicago, which is
Yeah.
where I got my PhD from. We wanted to stay in Chicago. It was at Trinity that I first learned about race in America, which I know perhaps in this day and age sounds absolutely crazy, but it was possible, I think, for me, sort of in my insulated world, to really, I hadn't really thought deeply about race and how it affected the church and that sort of thing. And Trinity oriented me towards that. And we thought a lot there about how race and place intersected. And my husband and I really wanted to stay in Chicago. We wanted to live on the West Side,
Yeah.
which is where we eventually moved. And so I was just looking for PhD programs that were local, which is not usually for PhDs in history. People try to go far and go to the most prestigious place you can. UIC ended up being an amazing place to study,
Mm.
and it was there that I had a chance to really dig into the history of race in America, through the lens of cities and suburbs. I was trained in it as an urban historian. Also, we were living in the Austin neighborhood. I'm white. And Austin at the time, and remains predominantly African American, although now there's more of a Hispanic presence in the neighborhood. And this is in the city of Chicago, not Austin,
Yeah,
Texas.
a little different
Uh,
down by me. Yes,
yep, yep.
for sure.
I'm sure you have your own dynamics. But that while there, we were attending an interracial church led by a black pastor, and we really got to. They taught me a lot about forgiveness and grace and speaking sort of frankly and
Mm.
openly about race. So I was sort of going at it from multiple perspectives, both academically and then just in our lived experiences. Um, but I really started thinking about how history shapes us as people, um, once I started working at Wheaton College, where I began working with wonderful colleagues who are really deeply committed to whole person development. And so started thinking a lot about how history can transform us.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good story. So I actually, my wife and I, we lived in Bridgeport, which is just south
Yeah.
there. So we drove by UIC like every day, basically down Halstead. It's right
Hmm.
there in the. There's. It's funny how these little, we cross paths so many times in here. That's fascinating to me. Yeah, history is interesting. I love history. I love reading history. And in grad school, I took some classes on kind of history and doing history. So, what we're going to be talking about your book, "Ordinary Heroes of Racial Justice," and we're going to get into it. Something I really enjoyed about your book, though, is that while you were doing history, you were kind of walking us through the process of doing history. And I assume that was intentional. What was your thinking behind kind of helping people see your methodology there?
Yeah. Well, it came out of my teaching,
Okay.
actually. So, over a course of a semester, we get 4 months, faculty and students get 4 months together to
Yeah.
do the work that we have in front of us. And I was thinking about the transformation that comes, especially with students who aren't history majors, who have no interest in history. They think it's boring and they're in my class because they have to take it for a requirement. And then when they start to do the work and when they read primary sources and when they realize that it's much more complex than they ever thought it could be, and when they realize there's very limited things that they actually can say about the past, and I sort of seeing that transformation, I wanted to do that work in a book.
Yeah.
And I have a colleague, Tracy McKenzie, who is Art Holmes Chair of Faith and Learning in my department, and he's done that in some of his books. And I wanted to write a book like that because I think that the content that we study certainly matters. But I think who we become as we do the work is actually just as important. And so I wanted to write a book that helped people sort of walk through that process. Most history books tell a story; they don't show the fits and starts and the
Yeah.
unanswered questions. We we come to our conclusions, and that's just the genre. That's how most historians write. But I was trying to sort of peel back the layers a little bit to help people reflect about how they think.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciated that a lot as I read through. I was like, oh, that's cool. You kind of get a sense of kind of like your research. Like, hey, I had this question. And so I started researching this, and it was pretty fruitless, actually. Like I still have a lot of answered questions. And I think something I've been wrestling with is that so many people see history as like a hard science or something, that
Yeah.
like when you tell a history, you're telling exact facts the exact way, and so we assume that we're doing science, and yet history is just so not science. It's storytelling in so many ways. Is that would you agree with that?
That's such a good question. And so you're asking me this in 2025. And if you asked a historian this probably 150 years ago, they would give you a different answer.
Okay.
So, all this to say, every field has a history. And there's been sort of a trajectory, just sort of 30,000 feet. There have been historians who will say it is a science.
Sure.
And history should, in colleges, it should be under the social sciences. And in high school, history is considered a social studies
Hmm.
along with sociology and psychology. And those are sciences.
Yeah.
And they would say, you can sort of peel back the past and we can try to uncover everything that's happened.
Hmm.
My take, which is very much coming out of some of the turns in the 60s and 70s, is that I actually think history does belong in the humanities. And I would say that one of my favorite definitions of history is that it's true stories. So, yes, history is stories.
Yeah.
And I tell my students, and I had to do that with this book too, like you have to make a choice. You simply cannot include everything in the story.
Right.
Um, but it also has to be, and to actually drive this point home a little bit further, history is different than the past.
Hmm.
The past is everything that has happened, down to the molecular level, up to like the planets and what's happening, and then all the political stuff, social stuff. And nobody can know all of the past. Only God can know all of the past. C.S. Lewis has uh, a metaphor where he talks about the roaring cataract of the ages, like this waterfall coming down. And we're standing with our little cup trying to catch some of the water. And the waterfall is the past. And what we're catching in our cup is history, it's the
Hmm.
remembered past. So it has to be. It's a story. Like we have to make choices, and every generation asks different questions. Um, and so there's going to be sort of different inflections to the narratives historians write today versus 50 years ago versus in 50 years. Um, and then there's different sources that are available, but the stories also have to be true. They have to be grounded in evidence. And you have to account for complexity, and you have to account for arguments about what has happened that are different from yours as well.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great explanation. I appreciate that. I guess I'm becoming more disturbed, I guess, by the ways in which people kind of manipulate the historical discipline in some ways, right? There's been some like revisionist history going on, about World War II recently, like kind of in our culture. Even Dr. King, I think, is in a great example of this, especially as the white community sort of takes on, Dr. King on MLK Day, and throws out a couple of quotes. So I guess the trouble is that with history being stories, you can almost manipulate those stories and sort of sound intelligence, right? And sort of make it be whatever you want it to be in some ways, right? So there's that kind of like the opposite dynamic of it being like a hard science or something. I wonder if there's ways that you could talk like just normal people out there who don't have history degrees. How do we educate ourselves well about history?
What a good question. Um, so I would say probably one of the biggest sort of moves or questions that I, as a historian, am often asking is what is the perspective of the person telling the story? And so, um, to take a somewhat obvious example, If you watch Fox News, you're going to get one narrative. And if
Right.
you watch MSNBC, you're going to get another.
Right.
And so you need to account for the biases that are present because everyone has them. We
Right.
all have our own blinders, myself included. And many of them we may not even be able to see. This is actually part of the benefit of reading history and reading old books is that you can start to see the blinders of your own age because you see, wow, things were really strange back then. Um, so I would try to discern what the contexts are or what the biases and like the context that the people are coming from, and then also as much as you can listen and read sort of widely across from different perspectives, and then also look at the sources. A narrative is only, and this is true, history is true stories, it's not just stories, but a
Yeah.
narrative is only as good as the sources that it's grounded in. But you also like sources again, you can't really think about a source without thinking about its context. So are people cherry picking? It's like if you're, reading the Bible and you're just sort of cherry picking to
Yeah.
make your point, or are you looking at the whole scope of scripture? And so you have to treat the sources behind the stories responsibly. Um, I would also, so I would think about context and bias. I would try to practice empathy for different perspectives.
Mm.
History, the discipline sort of demands it to not go in the past and sort of look to try to find what you want to find, but to
Right.
try to understand people in their context. And then also recognize, like, have humility. So if someone's saying this is exactly what happened, there's probably more to the story. And if you're married, you and JJ are married, an event can happen in your family's life and you guys will see it
Yeah.
differently.
Totally.
And this happens all the time. So I think we can have humility also, to recognize like I may have this story, but there's probably more to it.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I appreciate you delving into that. Yeah, I think people who haven't studied a lot of history or do this even professionally just don't think about those sort of things, like the sources and the biases behind what we're reading, or even reading different accounts of the same story can really like bring about some amazing, this is this person's perspective on this history, but this is, this other person's. And then, yeah, so I appreciate you delving into that. That's good.
Yeah, yeah. I think people often think that history is just like a story,
Yeah.
a narrative. And we're not necessarily at fault for that. If you think about how most people are taught history, it's relying on a textbook that offers a grand narrative that does
Uh,
not sort of peel back behind the scenes and say, these are, the reasons that we made the choices that we did in constructing the narrative this way. It just tells you this is what happened. And so I think that part of that sensibility or that subtext that we have about what history is leads to these conflicts people have today, but they've been having them for years over like
yeah.
what's the true story for American history, for example, like
Yeah.
what is actually, what's the narrative of American history? And I would say, well, there's not a narrative, but um, we can think about different narratives of U.S. history. And as a teacher, one of the things I really want students to learn, and just everyday people, I want us to think about how we're doing history and how we're constructing the stories that we're telling, not only about the past, but also about your friend or your spouse
Mhm.
or your boss. All of these things, like we have limited knowledge, and so we just have to pay attention to the stories that we're constructing because they have consequences.
Yeah, they do. Yeah. Serious. Yeah, that's good. That's good stuff. I want to jump back into your story here for a little bit, because so you end up doing a degree, a PhD in history, and you're focused on civil rights movement specifically, or what were you focused on?
Yeah, so my concentration was on work, race, and gender in the urban world.
Okay.
I really leaned into race and urban history. And my first book was on Catholics in the civil rights movement in Chicago. So
Ah,
Bridgeport
yeah.
um, plays a role in that with Mayor Daley
Dailies.
being a
Yeah,
Catholic.
for
Yeah,
sure. Yep.
there were a lot of Catholics marching against him. Actually, it's a complicated story.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was really interested in questions of race and Christianity. I landed on Catholics for my first book, just because they were. I was looking for. I wanted to understand race in America and Christianity in America, but I wanted my disposition is towards optimism. So I was looking for people who I knew were not perfect, but who seemed to be trying to do good. And I found these Catholics, and they had this rich history and rich theology that
Yeah.
was great to write about and a blessing personally to me too.
I love that. That's good stuff. So what is it about that period of time? Like, what captured you about that? What made you want to delve into the civil rights and, racism and all of that?
Yeah, it was my time at TEDS at Trinity
Okay.
that I think really captured my imagination and an experiential learning opportunity that I had. The one of the years I was there full time because I was part-time student for a while. On our spring break trip, I helped coordinate what's called a Sankofa journey, where you're looking back in order to try to look forward. And we went on basically a civil rights tour of the South. And we were partnered with people from different racial backgrounds, and we stayed in a room with them and we sort of processed things together.
Huh.
And it was just incredible to see to just begin to understand this history and to think about how race had shaped my own country, but even more so my faith. I also read a book by Michael Emerson and Christian Smith called "Divided by Faith," which came out I think in 2001. And it was in a class that I had this sense that like I had to be in the class. I asked the faculty; the class was full. Dr. Peter Cha is the faculty member. He was like, I'm sorry, like I teach this every semester. You can take it next semester. I was like, I'm supposed to be in this class. I don't know why. I just need to be here. And so he let me in. Um, and it just changed my life because in the
Uh-huh.
book, these two sociologists asked the question of why are white and black evangelicals so similar theologically, but politically, and this was in 2001, so they were doing their research in the 90s.
It's
But
changed. It's even changed a little
politically,
bit since
it's
then too.
even
Yes.
I
Right.
think the trends have continued,
Yes.
but they're
Very much
so
so.
different politically and when it comes to how they speak about race. White evangelicals will use individualistic terms and can't seem to see the systems. And sociologists, speaking about bias, like the questions they ask are all about systems and how are social systems shaping things. So they assume that race is embedded in systems, and they also show how it is. Um, but Black evangelical Christians who have the same theological beliefs will point to systemic racism
Yeah.
often as just part of their everyday lives. And so they determined in that book that evangelicals have a theological toolkit that emphasizes relationalism, anti-structuralism, what was it? There's three of them,
Individualism
and
was that?
individualism.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. You've read it.
I did. I read it. I loved it. It was such a good explanation.
Mm, so helpful. And
Yeah,
I
for
read
sure.
this and I thought, oh my gosh, this is me.
Yeah.
This is like totally my life, my experience. And I thought, what can I like? What can I do? I need to respond. And one of the responses actually came in the form of John Perkins, who's one of the people I write about in
Yeah.
Ordinary Heroes of Racial Justice. He came to campus. He was still traveling then. And
Wow.
I read some of his work, and he talked about his 3 R's of relocation, reconciliation, and redistribution. And I was really captured by those. And so we relocated to the Austin neighborhood. And it was just transformational. But I think those, and then I had this sense of calling of just like writing history, doing history, but I was so captured by this problem, and the civil rights movement seemed so fruitful.
Yeah.
Um, I think it also was a matter of sources being available. And I've always liked more recent history. The World War II generation, probably because of my grandparents, has captured my imagination. And so, but so I, that, my first book actually is about it starts in the 1919 Chicago race riot and goes through the 1970s. So it's that sort of middle 20th century. Um, that's really my grandparents' lifetime, which maybe all history is biographical in some way, or autobiographical. So
Yeah, ministry and calling. I mean, I feel like they're all like your story. That's why I was so excited to talk about your story because it's very clear how God crafted your story to have the passion for doing the things that you were doing right now, right? You saw the reality. You use your historical lens, like something that you're passionate about already, to sort of bring all God just brings all those things together, and I think it's really cool. I love hearing about that.
Yeah. We often only know sort of looking backwards, and then
Yeah,
we think, and this is one thing actually as a historian and as a Christian that I wrestle with, because I'll look at my life and I'll say, this is how I think God opened doors, but I add the I think, because I
yeah,
don't necessarily know the mind of God.
yeah,
And I'll study people in the past who will be doing things that I think are just awful. And they're like, the Lord, this is God's guidance clearly.
yeah.
So I have some humility around that. But I look
Mhm.
together, like we look back and you think, wow, God was leading me, doors were opening. I'm so grateful for the journey I've been on. But it was hard for me not knowing from the beginning, not knowing the end at the beginning.
Very much so. Yeah.
It's the path we walk.
It is. It is very much so. So during this time, it was in grad school, right? That y'all ended up at the Rock Church in Austin, right? And you experienced a interracial church, a diverse. You were in a diverse community. Can you talk a little bit just about how that period of like being in a church with various with diversity, like affected kind of the way you see church and history now?
Yeah, thank you. That was one of the sweetest times in our lives. And
Yeah,
when we were there, I didn't anticipate leaving ever. And I can talk about why we did. It was just coming up against our limits as humans.
sure.
But so Rock Church is one of the churches I actually write about in my book also.
Yeah.
And Pastor Raleigh Washington, who's an African American, founded the church in the 1980s. And he partnered with Circle Urban Ministries, which was sort of the outreach arm of Rock. And they, because of experiences that both of them had had in the past, they were deeply committed to talking about race, which is really actually pretty countercultural, but to talking about race in a way that was like drawing people together.
Yeah.
And they embedded this not only in their own relationship, um, but in the liturgy of the church. And so once a quarter, they had what they called fudge ripple meetings.
I love
Um,
I love this story. It was such a great example of yeah, sorry. I
did you ever go to one?
No, no, no. I never did. So yeah, so we had talked about I actually went to Rock Church for it was a period of time while I was at Moody. So I know the church. I never like was into the church though. Like I was an attendee.
Hmm.
And I regret that I didn't, go further into that. But I don't think I knew how to at that time.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah.
There's seasons, and you get what you're ready for,
Yeah.
perhaps. Well, what they did was once a quarter at these they would be an all-day affair, and they'd have the white people in the church meet together with Pastor Raleigh and just talk about racial things, and they'd have the African Americans meet together. They use a lot of racial humor, um, which if you're within the context sounds normal, but they'd have the chocolates and the vanillas.
Yeah.
And if you were married to someone from the opposite race, you could go to the other meeting. And if you weren't, it was a mostly and remains mostly a white and African American church, or
Yeah.
African American and white. It's predominantly African American.
Yeah.
Um, but if you were another racial background, you could choose where you wanted to go. And then they would sort of talk about the various issues that they thought were coming up. And then they'd have church, and then they get together after church and they'd eat Oreo cookies and fudge ripple ice cream.
I love it.
And they had this big giant Oreo cookie um, that they could put questions in, and they'd ask questions, and they'd be like serious questions like, why are the black men marrying white women?
Yeah.
Because there were some interracial marriages in the church. But then sort of funny ones like, why do black people a grocery store in the Chicago area is called Aldi. Why do they call it Aldi's plural instead of
Mhm.
Aldi? And so they just would talk about racial issues. And Raleigh's rule was, if like anything, you can talk about anything in these meetings, but we have to raise them together. You cannot leave the meeting and talk with another person of your same racial background about what happened. That would
Yeah.
be sinful, but raising it in the meeting is not. And these meetings, what people who were there during the heyday of these meetings, what they developed and what they talked about developing was this racial and cultural and spiritual sensitivity. They would talk about things. They might not come to the same perspective, but they could at least understand why someone from a different race had the same perspective,
Mm,
or why people who were in the same racial background thought differently than them, because not all white people are the same, not all
yep.
black people are the same. When we joined the church, Raleigh had left, and Pastor Abraham Lincoln Washington, his brother, was the pastor. The current pastor is Pastor Rob Stevenson, who I spent the most time
Mm,
under his leadership. But we joined a church that had been shaped by these meetings. People who were used to talking about difficult issues and were used to extending grace to one another, but who refused to sort of brush stuff under the rug. So
right.
the church was dealing with with its challenges, and with issues that would come up, and it was so healthy for my husband and I to come into this context, and we were also recently married. Like, we had like been married a month before we started going to this church. So we were having,
Yeah.
conflict of as many people do in their first year and multiple years of marriage. And so we're sort of learning these skills, and just in this culture where people just dealt with conflict. And they refuse to like separate. And they also refuse to say like, you know, eh, this would be controversial today, but a lot of people in the interviews, I conducted oral history interviews for this part of the book. They talked about how we're all level at the foot of the cross, and um, it's not only white people who can be racist; black people can also be
Mm, yeah.
racist. They would say, and so I think those sensibilities were just really powerful and helped me develop empathy, which, as a historian, is also important.
Yeah, for sure. I wonder. I love that story. I wonder, how did you? Okay, so most white people, let's just be honest, like, are very rarely ever in the minority anywhere that they go. Right.
Yeah.
That's how we live. I'm a white man. I don't have to be in a position where I'm in the minority if I don't want to be. I get to make that decision. Right. And
Mhm.
so you and your husband, as you started like entering into this community, and I'm sure there were many times where you were the only white people in a group. What was that like? Like how did that go? How do you think back on that?
I'm really grateful for it, precisely because of what you just said. Most of my life, and I've been very comfortable. Like, I don't have to stretch. I
Right.
don't have to code switch. I'm just in a context that's comfortable to me, and that
Yeah.
sort of um, just fits with what I've been raised with. Um, and I think it was so I am so grateful for the experience. One, it made it so that I couldn't think that race didn't matter,
Right.
because when I walked around the streets of the Austin neighborhood and I walked regularly, I took public transportation, I was always aware of the fact that I was white. And if I saw other white people in the neighborhood who I didn't know, I thought, "Why are you here?"
Right. Yeah.
And that's good. That's
Yeah.
good to
Yeah.
have that experience. It gave me an urgency to see, to just be pay attention to race in
Yeah.
America, um, and how it affects the children of God,
Yeah.
and like people's everyday lives, and people who are born into, because it's not just racism, and race is not just personal and interpersonal, but like kids are born into the Austin neighborhood, then their life chances are just very different from those who are born into Wheaton, which is
Right.
where that I live now, just
Right.
because of the resources available to them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. I even thought, like, I'm really excited for this conversation because I feel like two white people discussing like the civil rights movement and the history of race in America, because I'm not sure that most white people even see that sort of thing as our history necessarily, right? Black historians are dealing with Black history in my experience most of the time, right? And so they're the experts, and most white Americans, I'd say in general, I'm generalizing, right? But don't see the civil rights movement as their history. Yet it's American history. This is like our history, and I think it's easy to kind of dismiss those things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think you're again generalizing, but I think you are right. And yet I think it's really important because it actually is our history.
Exactly. Yeah.
And if we can expand our sense of who we is,
Yeah.
I think that can be helpful. So as I think about ancestors in the faith or great Americans, um, Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King Jr.,
Yeah.
John Perkins, Raleigh Washington, and Paulette Washington, these are my ancestors
Yeah.
in the faith. And I can, um, and by acknowledging that, it gives me so many more resources because, and again, this comes to context. We have our blind spot. So I was raised in the suburbs of Chicago, and I have an individualist mindset. But when I was at Rock Church, we sang songs about how I worship God, but
Yeah.
we also sang a lot about how we worship God. And there's much more of a corporate sense of the church.
Yeah.
Um, and so we need these resources. When we think about the blind spots that we can have, I think we can read old books and we can try to study the past, but the body of Christ has tremendous resources. But we just have to be willing to sort of get outside of our context in order to read from brothers and sisters who have different perspectives.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that is a perfect segue into your book, Ordinary Heroes of Racial Justice, to like jump in there more because I mean, that's what you're doing really is you're equipping us with stories of people who did this very thing, both white and Black Christians, um, doing being part of the civil rights movement and breaking down barriers, racial barriers. So how did you think about the book? What was the genesis of the book?
Yeah, thank you for asking that, Curry. I think part of it came out of well, I love stories and I love individuals. And so people we can write great stories about significant civil rights leaders that we would know their names. Martin Luther King Jr. is probably the most obvious. Um, I am really attracted to everyday, sort of regular people.
I love that.
Um, and I think part of that's just as I think about why, it's probably just being a historian trained in the early 21st century, but and thinking about social history. So I wanted to understand everyday people, and one everyday person, she didn't make it into the book, but who has fascinated me is Mamie Till Bradley, who was the
Yeah.
mother of Emmett Till, who was a 14-year-old boy who was murdered in Mississippi in the 1950s. And many people who went to his funeral counted this as a moment when and who saw the pictures of his body counted it as a moment where they said this has to stop, we
Yeah.
need to make a change.
Right.
And I remember teaching about Mamie Till Bradley and Emmett Till, and she made the decision, the state of Mississippi agreed to send her son's body back as long as she wouldn't open the casket, and she said,
Right.
no, we're going to have an open casket funeral. And
Mm.
the black press covered um, they covered the funeral. So they made it a national event, something that would have just been another lynching, which was actually unfortunately fairly common. And I was preparing to teach in a civil rights movement class, and I had our first child, young son, and I was just thinking about what she had gone through. And I was at church, and we were singing. It was during worship, and I was just like crying, thinking about Mamie Till Bradley's experience.
Mm.
And what came to me and what I then started sort of digging into was like ho it ended up being, the discipline of lament, like the Hebrew tradition of lament, where
Mm.
we talk to God about our suffering. But there's also hope, like we rely on God, to act, and God can handle these big questions. Because I was thinking, like, how did Mamie Till Bradley handle this. Like, I just cannot imagine
Yeah.
this happening. And so I wanted to write about people who had seen this suffering and who had stepped into it. And my I did it through there. The book has 4 parts, and each is based on a person or a group of people. And that's just how I love to think. I think these individual stories can be really helpful because they can capture our imagination.
Mhm.
We can learn about a person. It sort of feels like we can meet them perhaps across time through the pages of a book. And so I was trying to, part of it was actually just I wanted to learn more about these people that I ended up writing about. I
Yeah,
wanted to understand
for
them.
sure.
And then I got to write about them, and writing is thinking. And so I was able to pull my thoughts together through writing the book.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I love that. And you tell these 4 stories and they all intertwine with one another as well. Right? It's not just, 4 individual stories, like they overlap and they're weaved together in a lot of ways.
Thank you. I'm glad that you saw that. Part of that, like, I ended up picking the 4 people, and it was a process of elimination. I would try the different people I was thinking about out on students and sort of see how they resonated.
Yeah.
And part of it is like you start to see connections once you get into the material, once you get into the archives or oral histories and reading the secondary sources, and then you see, oh my gosh, these guys, they were together at this thing, or
Yeah.
they knew each other. Like, who knew? And so it's
Yeah.
sort of an act of writing a book is kind of an act of faith or
Yeah.
conducting research because you
Mm.
don't know what's going to come up. But I was trying to also weave them together to sort of track. The book is structured. I tried to give snapshots of pockets of the entire nation, but also to sort of track generally change over time through the course of the Great Migration, which was the movement of African Americans from the rural South to the urban North, from the 1910s through the 70s.
Yeah, I mean, you just talked about maybe Till Bradley. That's an example of that. Like, moved to Chicago from Alabama,
Mississippi,
Mississippi.
Mississippi.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, from Mississippi, and Emmett was visiting family down in Mississippi when this event occurred, right? And when his
Yes.
body was moved to Chicago, where there was a huge Black population who had recently sort of migrated there, it became a much bigger deal. So yeah,
Yeah, and because of the Black businesses that were centered in Chicago also,
right.
that was a great strength of the Black community then.
Yeah. So that's I loved how everything came together. These were stories I had never really heard much about. I loved that about it, that there was these heroes of the Christian faith, fighting against the evils of racism, in ways that, like, are not flashy and overblown. Right? A lot of these people, they just poured out their entire lives doing this work, and there weren't these moments of, like, perfection they never saw. Yeah, they never saw so much of the work, like the outworking of their work in so many ways. Yet they were called to do the work, and they went about it as a calling on their lives.
Yeah. And I think that's maybe how most of us live, right?
Mm,
Some people will be like Martin Luther King Jr. Which or Rosa Parks. Like, people think about the civil rights
yeah,
movement when they think about those 2 people. But most of us will just live like our lives where we are, and we won't necessarily be known or remembered, but
right.
we can make a deep impact on our communities where we are placed. And we can also think carefully about where we live, was one of the other things I was wrestling with in the book.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. I recommend everybody check out the book. It's a great history, and, like, these are important things to be learning about and understanding our past and how it still affects today. Right? We still have a segregated church in so many ways, and that's what so many of these figures were fighting against. And we still need to. There's still work to be done, I guess I should say.
There is absolutely still work to be done. And I also take comfort. You talk about these people haven't seen the end, sort of what they were hoping for
Yeah.
didn't come to fruition all the time. But I think we're just called to be faithful where we are and to recognize too, like, we have this, like, as an American, we have centuries um, of the weight of race and how it's changed over time and how it's separated people and led to different hierarchies. And so I think it may take generations to undo. But I just have to act in faith because I can't see the end from the beginning or
Yeah.
from where I am now. I
Amen.
just have to do what's in front of me.
It's just hope, right? I mean, that's all we're talking about. It's just hope, right? That God's
Yeah.
got this, and that like this work, right? This is a theology of hustle. This work that I'm called to do now, contributes to God's kingdom. God's using it in ways that I can't even fathom.
Well, and that's the thing. It's God's economy is different than ours. And I
Mhm.
think, yeah, just the more I think about this, uh, some people who we think are really important today, even Christians who we think are really important, like we'll probably get to heaven and we'll
Mm,
say, "Oh my goodness, there were all these other people who were doing these things that we had no idea about."
yeah.
Um, and so his economy is different than ours, and it just doesn't operate with the same currency.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think that's really good. Okay. Okay. One thing I definitely need to, I very, I have an opportunity to talk to somebody who's a scholar in this area. So I want to pick your brain just a
Sure.
touch. Okay. And it relates to kind of my story in so many ways. Grew up in a small town in Texas, smallish town in Texas, go to college in the big Chicago. And in your book, you talk about it, Cabrini Green. I spent time in Cabrini Green hanging out with teenagers. And that's kind of what really captured my heart, like seeing these kids who have everything sort of stacked against them, and they're kids,
Yeah.
they're like everybody else. And so um spent two basically 20 years in Texas, 20 years in Chicago, now back in Texas. And I don't know. Okay, I'm just going to throw it out there and then we can kind of chop it up. How's that?
Sounds good.
So I've been reading this book, King, by Jonathan Eig, King's biography. And it was fascinating because there was so much history I didn't know. So much I didn't know. But King, Chicago's very near and dear to my heart. King goes to Chicago and has a horrible experience in Chicago. And he says this quote, and it just resonates with me. And I can't quite shake it. He says, those people of the South of Alabama need to come up to Chicago to learn how to hate.
Mm,
And I just feel like there is this sense in that there's a sense in America that the South is racist, and that the North was always non-racist. It never struggled with any of these stuff, this stuff. And there's this dichotomy, and I just have this sense that we don't fully grasp the racial divides of the North so many times. We talk about the hatred of the South, and that's where the civil rights movement went down in so many ways. But the struggles of people who lived in the North are just as hard or maybe harder. Would you agree with that assessment of things?
yeah. Well, that's actually I think I would probably with a lot of what you said. Um, and that's actually why I started the book with Catherine DeHuick, who's this refugee from the Russian Revolution.
Yeah.
She was an aristocrat. She came to Canada and then she went to Harlem. And then we talk about I talk about her sort of realizing what race is like in America
Yeah.
in Harlem, which is a neighborhood in New York. I started in the North in part because I'm a Northerner,
Yeah.
and I don't want to implicate someone else and not be implicated
Sure.
myself.
For
But
sure.
often, as like those of us up here can say, like that's the South's problem.
Right. Right.
And when I was writing about John Perkins in Mississippi, I grappled with the question like, is Mississippi America and Mississippi's racial past, or is it Mississippi?
Yeah.
And I landed on it's America. Like
Mm,
this represents America because Congress not passing anti-lynching laws, like
yeah.
that allows the sorts of things that happened in Mississippi in the 1960s and prior to happen. It's a national issue, and we also can't separate ourselves. I would also say, and so what it seems like in the North, as I've looked at race and tried to sort of understand how it's developed, I think a lot of it really has to do with place,
Mm,
and where people live. You talked about Cabrini Green,
yeah.
and that is I believe there's still the historic original sort of row homes
There's row houses. Yeah,
are
all the
there,
towers are
but
down.
the
Yeah.
towers are down,
Yeah.
and it's
I
now
actually went in the towers at one point while I was at
okay.
Moody, which was
Yeah.
quite an experience, you know.
Well, I Moody, I that was Lonnie Carine and
Yeah.
Glenn Carine's
Yeah.
experience
I was like,
also.
I'm there. This is
Yeah,
all, yeah.
these are your people.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
but it's place-based, right? Like
Yeah.
Mayor Daley from Bridgeport didn't want public housing, which at that point had become racialized by the 1960s in Bridgeport. There's still no public housing, at least the big sort of concentrated public housing there.
And Bridgeport's still a majority white, or at least it was when I lived in Bridgeport. You know, you're on the south side of Chicago, which is a majority black, but Bridgeport's this little like, it's like a carve out almost
Yep.
of the south side. Yeah.
Yeah. So the place, like where you live, matters.
Yeah.
And speaking about historical empathy, so one of the things I've grappled with is why would King say that? Like Southerners come north to learn how to hate, or I've never seen hate in the South like
Yeah.
I have in the North. It's way worse up here. And I think it was more than just personal individual racism. I think there's all these things that are sort of happening behind the scenes, sometimes unintentional, not always racially motivated, sometimes racially motivated, that people get caught up in. So with those white Catholics who were throwing rocks at King and turning over cars when he joined civil rights movement activists in Chicago who invited him.
Yeah.
And the Catholics that I studied for my first book have been very involved in that. But these were like working class folks who the logic of their Catholic faith had actually led them to invest deeply in their neighborhoods.
Mm.
Their Catholic Church had switched in the early 20th century to a frame of parish ministry. So they used to have national parishes, so all the
Yeah.
Poles would go to one parish, the Irish would go to another, etc. And you would have school in your own home language because
Mm.
the Catholic Church is a church of immigrants. And in the 1910s, Cardinal Mundelein became the first cardinal west of, um, uh, or in like the West in Chicago. And he'd been archbishop and was made cardinal. And he wanted to Americanize the church. And this is right as World War One is getting going. He was of German descent. Like they're not eating sausages
Yeah.
because that's
Yeah.
German and those are the Huns.
Yeah.
And so he says, no native languages. Everyone has to learn in English. And we're
Mm.
not going to have we're not going to have national churches anymore. You're going to go to church where you live, which because of sort of how Chicago, like where people settled, generally the parishes still were segregated, but they switched to a geographic parish model. And priests would say, buy your house, like buy those Chicago bungalows. And so these are working class people who
Yeah.
invested in their neighborhoods. And when Black migrants from the South started coming north, they were very unlikely to be Catholic. The Black Catholic Church in the North is very much a story of conversion. People would convert because of the schools and
Yeah.
the schooling that their kids had. Um, but they found these white Catholics who were working class folks who invested their life savings in their homes found that the Black neighbors they weren't going to be Catholic. And what just seemed to happen was that they would be forced out of their neighborhood. Now, what they
Yeah.
didn't know was by the 1930s, the federal government, through the FHA and the Homeowners Loan Corporation, had developed a system of mortgage maps that banks started to use that redlined and said we're not going to give mortgages in minority neighborhoods or in neighborhoods that are mixed or are in danger of being mixed. So even
Yeah.
if you're a white person who wants to stay and wants to buy a house in a mixed neighborhood, you can't. So the people, it was very very personal, I think, and they felt like they had been pushed out. Which is not to say what they were doing was right, but it's to say that they were caught up in a system that was larger than themselves, and all they knew was that many of them had felt like they had to move, and they'd already moved, and now it seemed like they were going to have to move again when King is marching through these neighborhoods,
Yeah.
or they also marched through Cicero, and
Yeah.
he was not there for that march, but it was uh, it was a moment because Cicero had been the site of this housing violence in 1951, and Black people knew, like, stay out of the town of Cicero.
Yeah, Cicero's now a majority minority, I think, city, right?
Yes.
But back in the day, that was not the case. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, race, I would say race in the North is complicated. There's a line, I can't remember where I read this, but they say in the South, they don't care how close you get, just as long as you know your place. And in the North, they don't care sort of like how high you advance, just as long as you don't get too close. I don't know if that's been, and the they being white people,
yeah,
but that was sort of a quip from civil rights activist in the time. And it seems like in some ways there may be some continuity.
yeah. Yeah, no, I definitely resonated with that, and I guess I'm working through all this, especially being in a it's a majority Black church, it's a diverse church, it's majority Black, and I'm learning these things. I'm trying to wrap my mind around just how these things you just don't ever learn. Like I never learned any of that sort of thing. I never understood Dr. King and like how he ended up in Chicago, and yeah, yeah, I hope people just get the bug to like educate themselves. I think your book's an amazing starting point. Like anybody could pick this book up and read it. It's just a story and, get so much out of it. So I guess I'm saying I appreciate the work for sure.
Oh,
So,
I'm glad you like it.
yeah.
And I will say too, like you being part of as a white person, being part of an interracial church, but that's not majority white is actually really, really good. Lonnie K. Ryan, one of the people in the book, one of the founders of Rock Church, who's a white woman, one of the things she said when I interviewed her was she just encouraged white people to submit themselves to leadership from someone like of a person of color. Um, and she
Yeah.
just talked about not as like I want to be woke or it's the right thing to do, but like as a spiritual discipline, you will learn and God will use that to teach you. And she's no longer in the Austin neighborhood, but she is currently, her pastor is Hispanic. And I think it's just been it's just been profound for her and sort of the sensitivity that we can develop to other people so we can grow in our love of others and love of God. And that's ultimately what I was hoping for
Yeah.
with this book is to be able to help people with that.
Yeah. I love that. And I concur. All white people should have that experience. And I think church is an amazing place for it. We should be bringing people together. It stinks that work is the place that most people are in diverse situations. It should be church.
Yeah,
So yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. Okay, so are you ready to kind of hop into our two questions as we wrap up?
sure. I would love to.
Okay, so my first question is, what is the strangest job that you have ever had?
Yeah. So I was thinking about this question and I thought, well, strange probably depends on context. What seems strange to me might not seem strange to you. So like if I grew up in a mining town and I said I was a miner,
Yeah.
like that would be really weird, but it might be normal to me. I didn't grow up in a mining town. I think the strangest job I had was actually selling knives in college. I sold Cutco cutlery.
Cutco. Yeah.
Yep, many
Okay.
people probably have. But it was strange because at the school where I went to, the people there were sort of socially committed, like make the world better, and I was selling knives, and my friends were like, "What are you doing?" Um, but it was so good for me because it taught me to be persistent, and that is a life skill. That allows you to write a book. That allows you to run a podcast. You just have to be persistent.
Yeah. That's amazing. I love that you sold Cutco. My brother-in-law sold Cutco. That's a grind right there. No doubt.
Yeah. Do you have Cutco knives?
I do not, but my in-laws do. And
Okay.
yeah, so it's a thing. It's a thing. So my final question then is, what is one piece of advice you would give to somebody looking to bring God's kingdom more into their work?
Yeah, thank you. I love that second question. And I was listening to your interview with Adrian Parker, and I was
Yeah.
like, I know what I would say. And then he said kind of what I
I
would
love it.
say. And
Love it.
my short answer would be cheat at work.
Hmm.
We are limited finite people despite
Yeah.
the powers of technology. And we only have so much time and energy and attention. And I think I heard Andy Crouch say this before I started teaching at Wheaton. And it sort of has become a mantra in our department. Like you've got to cheat somewhere. You can't give everything to everyone. Like the
Yeah.
the demands are infinite. And so I try to I try to recognize that the work I do, like God has called me to, but it's ultimately like I'm joining God in God's work. It's not totally dependent on me. And so I can leave and I can be with my kids and be with my family.
Yeah.
And there's only one person who can be their mom. There's only one person who can be my husband's wife. And so I need to sort of lean into that and let God take care of both that. Like it's also that's his work that I'm joining him in. But God's really blessed my work, my historic, academic, professional work. I think I don't know why, but even sort of not doing as much as I could, not trying to be a perfectionist and having everything done exactly how I would like it. Just let it be. So that'd be my advice.
I love it. I love it. I think that's great advice. I think more of us would should heed that advice. That's good stuff. Karen, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast. It was great to get to pick your brain a little bit.
Thanks so much for having me. It was my pleasure.
Thanks so much for hanging out and listening to A Theology of Hustle. Make sure that you like and subscribe, all the things, and follow me at Theology of Hustle on Instagram. My hope is that this podcast just encourages you in your work, whatever that may be. So until next time, get out there and hustle.